You've spent hours fine-tuning and dialing in your MLB DFS lineups, convinced you found the perfect low-owned stack to crush the slate. But when you go back to check your lineups later and see how you're doing, you see these dreaded three letters, PPD. Weather is the silent killer of MLB DFS lineups, and while it's not the sexiest topic in DFS, as an outdoor game, it is crucial to understand how weather plays a part in MLB DFS strategy. And as we approach peak storm season, it's even more important to be prepared now so you know how to handle difficult weather situations when they come up before lock. In this video, I'll give you everything you need to know about this particular part of MLB DFS. And if you stick around until the end of the video, I'll give you a code that you can use to import into your SaberSim builds to steal my advanced lineup rules I use to handle particularly tricky weather situations. Now, first off, most people think about weather in MLB DFS through the lens of games being postponed, but weather is a consideration even if there is no rain scheduled on the slate. Weather has a big effect on the way games are projected overall. Wind, the game temperature, and humidity can all affect hitting and pitching performance. Hot weather with winds blowing out promote hitting, and cooler temps and wind blowing in will help the pitchers. But you can't oversimplify this and assume you should always be jamming in hitters into your lineups if they're playing in good hitting weather. Different parks are affected by weather patterns in different ways. Wrigley Field, for example, is famously one of the most wind-friendliest parks in the MLB, and wind blowing out at Wrigley has a massive impact on increasing team totals. On the flip side, Oracle Park in San Francisco was designed to specifically mitigate wind patterns around the ballpark. Even a particularly windy day out there won't have much of an impact on the way that the game is projected. Plus, these weather factors need to be taken into account alongside the rest of the factors that matter for projecting the game. On one hand, ignoring weather factors will put you behind the eight ball in MLB DFS in 2024, but you need to contextualize these factors with the other things like the quality of hitters and pitchers on that particular slate, ownership, salary, and so on when it comes to making your lineups. Now, SaberSim accounts for these weather conditions in our simulations, as well as the specifics of that particular park and how they might promote or mitigate those weather conditions, but we also place it in the context of the rest of the slate in our simulations. What we don't directly account for is weather risk, the chance of games being postponed or suspended or delayed due to rain, and that's the main point of this video. Playing players who don't play baseball that night in our lineups is obviously going to be a bad thing, but the reason there is a strategic element to navigating this postponement risk is because there is a range of possible outcomes when it comes to these things. Not every game with a little rain postpones, and sometimes games with players in fantastic spots might forecast significant rain. Other times, 4 of the, say, 8 games on the slate might all have storms lingering overhead, so how do we handle these complicated situations in our lineups? Now, first, you should make sure you understand the rules of the DFS site you're playing on. All major DFS sites state in their rules that players in games that have been postponed will receive a 0. However, in practice, FanDuel in particular does have one major difference in the way that this actually plays out. On DraftKings, players in games that have been postponed keep their original game lock time. If a game is supposed to start at 6:10, begins in a rain delay, and then postpones at 7, and those players are in your lineup, you are out of luck. On FanDuel, they will unlock those players and adjust their game start time on the FanDuel app to whatever the last game on that slate locks at, letting you swap them out of your lineups as long as there are games still left to start. Now, keep this in mind, I looked everywhere in the FanDuel DFS rulebook, and I could not find this actually written in their rules that this is something they do. However, they've consistently been doing this for the last 2 full seasons of MLB DFS, so I'm going to continue to count on it for now until they show that they're not doing this anymore. The big takeaway here is that you can be significantly more aggressive with games with weather risk on FanDuel, knowing that you will generally have outs to swap to if the game postpones. If a game is extremely likely to postpone, and I'll give you more information on how to identify that in just a second here, it's probably still worth removing from your FanDuel lineups, but for most of the trickier situations where games maybe have a chance of a postponement, you can just play them on FanDuel and swap them out later if the game ultimately postpones. On DraftKings, Yahoo, and OwnersBox, we need to be more careful. The next thing you need is a tool to quickly identify the primary weather situations on the slate, and for that, I recommend Kevin Roth's weather dashboard over on RotoGrinders. I like to check this first thing in the morning, and more on why I do that first thing in the morning check in a couple minutes, but I check it again 20 to 30 minutes before lock so I have the most up-to-date information about weather on that slate as possible. Weather patterns can change really quickly. Just yesterday, when I'm recording this here, the Cincinnati at Pittsburgh game had no weather concerns whatsoever in the morning, but became somewhat of a postponement risk as the day went on and storms developed. Kevin Roth's dashboard here uses a color-coded system to assign weather risk, so let's break down what to look for here. Now, first, if a game is green or yellow-green, you can generally assume that it's going to have no real risk of a postponement. And on the flip side, if you ever see a game that's rated as red or orange-red, it is very likely to postpone or has already been postponed, and you should just immediately remove those players from your lineup pool, no questions asked. Yellow, orange, and orange are the main categories that we really need to be cautious of here, and where you need to be strategic to handle these correctly. These are games with some legitimate postponement risk, and I also recommend reading the written blurbs to get a better sense of what the actual situation is. You can see, for example, on this particular slate, the Twins and Rays game here looks like it has a reasonable chance of postponing on this particular slate. But these blurbs will give you some other information as well. Sometimes different ballparks are a little bit more comfortable playing in light rain. Some games have big storms coming in late, and the risk is more on a shortened game than a postponement. Some games might have random thunderstorm risk that could delay the game at any time but are unlikely to actually postpone the game, and so on. Reading these blurbs does give you a little bit more information on what you should actually be paying attention to in these games. Once you have an overall sense of what the weather looks like, I like to then get a sense of the actual slate itself. And you can do this by just running through a quick version of your lineup building process, using a test build on default settings and a test contest sim if you're on the SaberSim Ultimate plan. And I'll combine this with the forecast to get a sense of how I want to handle things. If a team is not showing up much in my top lineups, or even if they're just showing up about even with the field, I'm already going to be pretty comfortable fading if there is a risk of a postponement. The main thing I want to note here at this part is if a team or a game with big weather risk is showing up in a ton of my lineups, that might be a situation where I want to handle it differently. It's also worth noting when games start that have weather risk. The later in a slate the game with weather starts, the more time we have to make that decision. For example, we can start with that game in our lineups at the main slate lock and late swap out of it later if needed. But the later in the slate that game is, the fewer swap options we will have available when that actual game locks if it postpones. I'm generally a little more willing to play rainy games if they are later in the slate, because I do think getting that additional information is more valuable than having limited swap options later in the slate. This also has a lot to do with the fact that I tend to play very diversified portfolios of lineups. I'm often not going to have a huge portion of my portfolio allocated to one particular stack or even one particular game, and if I do, I'll talk about that situation here shortly, but most of the time it's pretty easy for me to swap the handful of lineups that might have any given stack in my portfolio. Now, once you know what's going on the slate and you're actually building your lineups, it's time to make some decisions, and my general guiding principle around weather is to be cautious, especially with games rated orange and even ones rated yellow-orange. Postponement risk for a game essentially adds X% of 0 fantasy point outcomes to a player distribution, where X is the probability of that game getting postponed. If you imagine the weather risk this way, it's generally going to drop the average projections for those players quite a bit and make them pretty bad plays once you're accounting for that risk of them not playing at all. Here's another way of looking at it. Can a team with a 50% chance to postpone or even a 25% chance to postpone be the stack you need on a slate? It certainly can. But are they so much more likely to be the team you need to win that slate that it's worth taking on an additional 50% chance to score 0 fantasy points compared to other teams projected around the same? This is almost never the case. I will personally just X out any game that is rated on orange on the weather dashboard before that particular game starts. So for example, going back to the Twins and the Rays game here tonight, this is a game that if that game was locking right now, I would just be completely removing from my pool. And again, keep in mind, this is a decision that I'm making at the time of the game starting, not main slate lock. In this particular example, this game starts 35 minutes after lock. We may already have some pretty confident information about the weather in this game by the time the slate locks. It may already be postponed, but this is a situation where I would probably want to check back in and keep an eye on the status of the game around 5:30 or so. I want to give myself as much time as possible to make that decision. And again, weather patterns can change significantly over a short period of time pretty often. If this game was even starting 30 minutes or definitely an hour later, I would probably leave it in my pool for lock, knowing that I can always remove those players as we get more information as the slate plays on. Now, this cautious approach to weather concerns can sometimes come back to bite you. Maybe the game plays and maybe it goes off. But playing a ton of players from a game that gets postponed immediately craters your slate, and I'm not comfortable taking on that extra level of risk for minimal additional upside. And this is generally true even if the game offers elite options. I see the orange rating here as being a pretty significant postponement risk, and one that I'm willing to fade in almost all cases. Now, let's go one step further here and talk about some notable exceptions and some more difficult cases to assess. My least favorite color rating on Roth's scale is yellow-orange, which I find is consistently the hardest to make decisions on. These are generally games with a non-zero chance of a postponement, but the chance of postponing is probably a fair bit under 50%. The opportunity cost of fading these games often starts to feel much higher to me when they're rated yellow-orange. For these games, my general guiding principle is still going to be cautious, but I will often do a little bit of extra research here. I'm not a meteorologist, but I'll often dig into the actual weather report at the park myself and see if I can find any extra info about when rain and when storms are likely to come. And I'll combine that with my initial build and contest sim that I ran and make a decision, being a little bit more likely to play the game if our sims really like that game. And if I'm well over the field on the players in that game, like say 2 to 3 times the ownership projections on that game, I'll often instead try to reduce my maximum exposure, maybe getting closer to the ownership projection to try to mitigate some of the risk I'm taking in that spot, but not fade it completely. Another difficult spot here is navigating small slates with weather risk. When there are less games on the slate, the opportunity cost of fading these games is much higher because you're eliminating larger portions of the player pool. Each stack on the slate has a greater share on a small slate of being the top stack, and each game you remove eliminates 2 full teams from the picture completely. In these situations, you may need to be a bit more aggressive with playing teams in bad weather games, especially when they are projected very well. And similar to smaller slates, medium to large size slates with many different weather games on the slate all pose a similar challenge. This happens pretty frequently for northeastern storms, where a game in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Pittsburgh may all be dealing with the same storm problem. And it's a lot harder to X out 4 games from an 8-game slate than it is to X out just 1. So how do we deal with these particular spots? Well, again, the safest and most risk-intolerant approach is to still be conservative. If 4 out of 8 games all have severe weather, it's very possible that 3 or 4 of those games all postpone. But if you're taking the approach of fading each of these games, you should be aware of the fact that you're crossing out big percentages of the player pool, and you just might be headed for a higher variance slate, whether those games play or not. Otherwise, one of the sharper things you can do here is to just be more conservative with your bankroll allocation on slates that present a lot of weather concerns, or on slates where a large percentage of the games on the slate have weather concerns. This is why checking the weather report first thing in the morning is a valuable part of the process here. You won't have all the info you'll have at lock, but it should give you a general idea of what to expect by the time lock comes around. If I wake up and I see that 25 to 30% of the entire player pool on an MLB slate or more has a risk of postponement, I'm going to enter less bankroll into that day's games. Now, if you are set on playing a game with postponement risk in your portfolio for one reason or another, there are a few things you can do at the lineup construction level to mitigate your portfolio risk, and this is where some more advanced weather strategy comes into play. I like to set rules to use hitters from teams in games with weather risk only in stacks. One-offs from these weather games can poison lineups unnecessarily. there is almost always a similar player from a game with no weather risk that can be plugged into the lineup as a one-off instead of the player playing in a game with a chance of postponing, with almost no change to the lineup quality. Plus, if you're not fading the game that has a chance of postponing, you really want to make the bet that you need that game to win, and if you do, you want to be stacking it up. So let me show you exactly how to create this rule in the SaberSim app. So you can do this in the lineup rules section on SaberSim. If we just expand this here, what we want to do is create a group rule, and this is going to be a conditional group rule. So I'll click add new rule, and let me first add these players back into my pool here so we can see this. And what we're going to do is we're going to say add new rule. Then we're going to do a group rule, and this is going to be an automatic group. And what we're going to say is if at least one primary player is used, we'll just use the hitters here in this particular case. This is a very important part here. We want to group this by team. Then we're going to say use at least 4 secondary players that are on the same team. So what we're saying here is if a player on a team is used, we need to use 4 players from the same team here for that particular build, basically saying we're going to force conditional stacks for just these teams in this particular spot here. The next thing we're going to do is save this as a manual rule, and this is the part that's going to allow us to actually edit what particular teams we're actually using here. So we'll save this, and this is going to create 20 rules for all of the teams on this slate. Now what I like to do is just uncheck the entire set, and then we'll find the teams that we actually want this rule to apply for. So on this particular slate, if I was convinced that I wanted to play Twins and Rays, I can go ahead and find them here. So we will add in Tampa Bay. Oh, I actually think, yeah, okay. So we do need this to be, it's a little more manual than I remembered here, but we'll check all of them in, and then we'll only leave the 2 checked that actually apply to what we're trying to do here. So in this particular case, we are just saying if a Twins hitter is used, we need to stack the Twins, and if a Rays hitter is used, we need to stack the Rays. Now you can come to your own decision on how you'd want to handle pitchers in this particular spot. You could certainly add them in as well to this rule. That's not really my approach. I tend to prefer to fade the pitchers in the weather games, even if I'm doing this with the stack, and just hope that I find pitchers from other games that tend to work out. So I would probably come over here and find those 2 particular pitchers and end up unchecking them from my builds. But this rule will allow you to play it in such a way where if you're using those hitters, you're doing so only in stacks, and you're not ending up with one-offs from either side of that game that are generally ruining or potentially adding some risk of ruining your lineups that are just stacking up other games on that slate. Now, I've dropped a code in the description of this video that you can import directly into your SaberSim to pull this rule into your builds. To do that, all you'll need to do is grab the code that's in the description here, head over to this share button, go to the load tab, and then enter that code here. And that's going to pull in that lineup rule here into your lineup rules section. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that I'm building this here for the June 18th slate. And obviously the slates and games and teams are always going to be a little bit different, particularly the teams that you're actually checking into this rule here. So anytime you're using this here, you'll want to come into the rule and actually edit it and resave it as a manual rule. So you're appropriately picking up the teams on that slate and then uncheck any of the teams it doesn't apply for here. You really just want to leave the games where the teams that are in weather risk situations as the boxes that are actually checked here. I find this really useful on those small slates or larger slates when there are a lot of games that have weather risk, or on the slates where there are teams playing it with weather risk that I really like, that are stacks that I want to get to. This is a way to get access to those teams, but you're siloing those lineups in such a way where if you're playing a Rays stack on this particular slate, it just is a Rays stack. You're not getting Rays one-offs in your Dodgers stacks. You're not letting this game postponing, ruining all of your portfolio potentially, or a big portion of your portfolio. It's just the lineups where you took a shot on that being the team that you need if the game actually played. Now, to summarize here, factoring weather into your MLB DFS data is important for accurate projections, but it needs to be contextualized based on the particular park and the other game factors for that game. And for games with severe weather, first, know the rules of the site that you're playing on, have the most up-to-date information about weather and the slate dynamics, In general, be cautious of games with weather risk and set reasonable expectations for slates with weather risk games, and use the tools like this lineup rule at your disposal to navigate them correctly. Weather really is only one small part of the MLB DFS puzzle, and while you need to know how to react when it happens, it's not going to happen every single slate. If you want a step-by-step guide on how to beat MLB DFS overall, check out this video next, and make sure to subscribe to get a notification every time I drop a new video. I'll see you in the next one.